All police officers in England and Wales will be vetted to the tougher standards set out in 2006. It comes after a serving Met police officer admitted to being a serial rapist, and the force itself admitted it was looking again at 800 officers, yes, 800 accused of sexual or domestic abuse.
The abuse of power that we've seen this week is absolutely despicable, and it needs to be addressed immediately.
But is even the new vetting process anything like rigorous enough? Not everyone thinks so. Also on News at 10 tonight. Inflation remains stubbornly high at over 10%. Joel will talk us through the implications. On strike, nurses walk out as it's announced ambulance drivers will join them for the first time on the 6th of Feb. Brace for impact. Debbie has a special report from deep in the Chinese countryside where people are worrying about how they will cope with the COVID surge.
Infections quickly engulfed this community, and in one neighbourhood, 13 elderly people died in less than a month.
Goff is there.
The curse of youth. The young Emma Raducanu is beaten by the even younger Coco Gauff down under. And a truly remarkable story of age. The world's oldest woman has died, having reached an incredible 118.
This is DanTV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. You might think it was a bit of a given that as organisations dedicated to combating crime, police forces would already have checked, double-checked, even triple-checked that their officers weren't, in fact, themselves criminals. But in an effort to restore trust in the entire service, after the admission by a serving London officer that he was a serial rapist, the Home Office isn't taking any chances. Every police force in England and Wales has been asked to cross-check all their officers and civilian staff against the National Police Database. But the admission by the head of the Met that 800 of his officers are being re-investigated for 1,000 alleged cases of sexual or domestic abuse has hardly inspired confidence, and there are many who do not think these checks go far enough. The Prime Minister called on forces to address their failings. For people who intimidate women and girls, Mr. Sunak said, there can be no place to hide.
How to restore public confidence when those who are meant to prevent crimes commit the very worst. Top of the agenda for the Prime Minister's talks with the Met Commissioner this afternoon, how a serial rapist could hide within his ranks for 2 decades.
The abuse of power that we've seen this week is absolutely despicable, and it needs to be addressed immediately. The government's done a huge amount already to protect the safety of women and girls, but we will keep going and doing whatever it takes to ensure that women and girls feel safe and can go about their lives freely and without fear.
This is the man who triggered the latest outrage. David Carrick, a serving Met police officer, simultaneously one of the UK's most prolific sex offenders. His case follows Wayne Couzens, a Met police officer turned murderer. He raped and killed Sarah Everard. But it's feared there are more abusers in uniform. All police forces now ordered to check their officers and staff against national databases to identify anyone who's slipped through the net. Currently, police recruits are asked to provide information about themselves, like their financial status and any criminal history. Forces should also do background checks on the applicant, their family and associates, and check their social media content. But currently, this is all just guidance. Now the Home Secretary's asked the College of Policing to make its rules stricter and clearer, so the guidance becomes a legal requirement for all police forces. This former Met Police Chief Superintendent says it's long overdue.
The current process isn't working because it's a tick box exercise that is filled out by the individuals. They choose whether or not they want to tell the truth. They choose how much information they want to give you. And that's why it's failing. It needs to be taken away from the police service, it needs to be an independent body, and it needs to be far more thorough.
Campaigners say the police must be policed and survivors heard.
There is this underbelly of misogyny within policing. We need to bring outside people in to look at the recruitment and vetting, and people need to hear from survivors. We've also arguing for a public inquiry to be put on a statutory basis.
The danger not only to survivors of abuse, but to public trust, vital for policing in a democracy.
And Rebecca is here to talk about all this. Look, one officer admits to being a serial rapist. We're now told there are 800, I mean, of course, allegations can be false, but 800 officers, I think it's going to strike people as an awful lot, being reinvestigated for very serious allegations against them as well. This is not the first time the vetting process has been in question by a long shot. I mean, this is a really difficult situation, isn't it?
It is, and you're right. It's not the first time concerns have been raised specifically about the vetting process. It was 4 years ago that the government promised to recruit an extra 20,000 police officers by March this year, and the police watchdog raised concerns about the size and speed of that could allow some officers to get through who don't meet the expected standards. Then in November, we had a report which said failures in vetting had allowed potentially thousands of predatory officers to join and remain in the ranks. It found examples of officers with criminal records, of family members with links to organised crime. At the moment, forces are expected to abide by the guidelines, but it's not a legal requirement. And that's what's changing today, alongside the announcement that all forces should recheck their officers. But campaigners say this is a bigger picture. This is about a cultural change, that abuse should not be excused as banter, that any allegations against serving officers should be handled properly, and that whistleblowers should be properly protected so that they can report any wrongdoing.
OK, Rebecca, that was very clear. Thank you very much indeed. Now, anyone looking at the price labels on supermarket shelves won't, of course, need telling, but food price inflation has reached levels not seen since 1977. The cost of food shopping went up by nearly 17% in the past year, a clearly staggering figure. According to the latest figures, there was a tiny drop in the overall rate of inflation. In December, prices rose by 10.5%. But to state the obvious, that's still an awful lot, just less than November's increase. The slightly smaller increase was mostly due to lower petrol prices. But the price of food hit that 45-year high, 16.8%, just as people stocked up for Christmas.
Switzerland is one of the few countries in the world where inflation isn't running rampant, but the cost of living crisis is top of the agenda at the World Economic Forum. Fuel prices have fallen sharply of late, but China, the world's biggest oil and gas importer, has just reopened its economy. Inflation may have peaked, but it may also prove persistent.
If you want to see oil prices going down sharply, I think you are on the optimistic side, unless Saudi Arabia and Russia will open the taps and bring a lot of oil in the markets, which I think is not a realistic assumption.
High inflation leaves everyone feeling poorer, even here in Davos. What's interesting, though, is that while the rich in the UK are actually wealthier than the rich in most European countries, those on middle and lower incomes in the UK are poorer than most of their European counterparts. According to new analysis by the Resolution Foundation, in 2009, the typical UK household had an annual disposable income, adjusted for inflation, of around £16,000, slightly less than the typical French and the typical German household, and much less than the typical American household. But look at how that gap has since widened. The typical American household now has a disposable income that is 64% higher than in the UK.
Living standards in the UK are falling relative to countries we like to compare ourselves to. We are falling behind. Why is that?
We are a much more service-based economy than many other countries, so there may be impacts from that.
Is Brexit a factor here?
Brexit will have had some issues with regard to the way that business operate and adjusting to it. On the other hand, I think it's now likely improving living standards.
It's a wonderful day. Some companies are feeling a little more cheerful. Apollo Tyres trades in 100 countries. It has finally stopped hiking its prices because the market price of oil and natural rubber has fallen.
but the road ahead still looks bumpy.
In Europe, there is a recession. Markets down by nearly 14% in passenger cars. Now, prices will stay where they are as raw materials have softened, so there is no increase in prices.
As consumers tighten their belts and economies slow, inflation should fall further, but there will be other consequences too. Today, Microsoft became the latest tech company to announce redundancies. 10,000 jobs are going worldwide. We will start feeling better off again at some point, but not just yet.
And Joel joins me now to talk about all this. Not like overflowing with good news at the moment on the economy. Are we really? And inflation looks to me to be stubbornly high. Are there grounds for optimism, do you think?
There are. This period can't go on indefinitely. Prices can't keep rising at the pace that they are, Tom. The question is, how long will it take before inflation is finally brought under control? The cost of living crisis is an absolutely urgent issue here at the World Economic Forum. Many countries are really struggling with a combination of high inflation and rising interest rates, and governments and central bankers are trying to work out how do they keep this painful period as short-lived as they possibly can. It's clearly, if you want to be optimistic, encouraging that the headline rate of inflation in the UK has eased, appears to have peaked, but it's still close to its 40-year high. And it's also encouraging that we've seen things like wholesale gas, wholesale oil prices fall so sharply in the last few weeks or so. But the biggest oil and gas importer in the world, China, has only just reopened its enormous economy. So it's not clear that either of those trends are really going to continue. The outlook is very, very uncertain.
Lots of economic data in the next 7 days. What does it mean for interest rates and people's mortgages?
Well, investors are betting that yet another interest rate rise is absolutely nailed on next month, possibly by as much as 0.5%. I mean, the UK has two issues, really, Tom, which will concern the bank. The first is that prices are rising really quite broadly across the economy. This is much more than just a food and energy story. Look at what's called core inflation, and it remains very, very high. Also, the second issue is that services inflation has risen very sharply indeed, a surefire, unmistakable sign that wage inflation is picking up domestically, which may sound like just the tonic, but the Bank of England will be concerned that companies are financing higher pay for their staff by simply raising their prices yet again.
Joel, I'll let you get back into the warm, but for now, thank you very much indeed. It is those rapidly rising prices back here, spelt out in the December inflation figure, that are fueling the pay claims of millions of workers. Tonight, we are halfway through a two-day nurses' strike, the biggest yet. It has affected about a quarter of hospitals and clinics in England. An even bigger strike day is looming, though. On the 6th of February, ambulance workers will join RCN nurses for the first time. It is one of 4 more strike days announced by their union, the GMB.
As the sun rose over Brighton this morning, a group of nurses were walking, not to work, but to the picket line, striking for the first time here after their union expanded its action. They huddled together, calling for better pay and patient safety.
We will have to take people out of recess who have been in horrible car accidents in order to get someone in, just so they don't have to die in a corridor. And that's an awful decision to make.
Many of the public don't see what we are seeing, and it's petrifying. We're frightened for today, we're frightened for the future. We will not stand for this.
Nurses from 55 trusts in England walked out in the freezing northwest, the southwest, and the east.
If anyone here thought that they didn't have public support, I think there's evidence today that that idea can be quashed. I've been on picket lines throughout this strike, and I have never seen more support for these nurses.
Even patients with appointments today had little to complain about.
I support them completely. I think they should be paid a lot more money for what they do.
I agree with what they're trying to do, but I also think it's a bit unrealistic the amount they're asking for.
There are those who have been affected, though. NHS England data shows nearly 5,000 operations and around 25,000 outpatient appointments were rescheduled across strike days last month. If this week's action matches that, it'll take the total to an estimated 10,000 operations and 50,000 outpatient appointments postponed. Andy Macklin had his treatment for kidney cancer cancelled today, but also doesn't blame the nurses.
They deserve the money. They desperately deserve the money. We can't carry on like we're carrying on. But in the meantime, I'm afraid, people like me and many others are suffering.
The government agrees at least on that point, but still refuses to talk about the nurses' offer to meet them halfway on pay.
Well, 10% isn't affordable. It'd be an extra £3.6 billion a year. And obviously that would take money away from patient services, essential services that we need to invest in, given the backlogs we have from the pandemic.
There is then no end in sight, only more strike dates and bigger ones at that. The ambulance service have announced 4 new days of action, one of which coincides with the nurses. Emily Morgan, News at 10.
And Robert's guests tonight on his Peston programme are the leader of Unison and the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. That's just coming up after the news in your part of the UK. Strike action in France tomorrow will be felt by ferry passengers on this side of the Channel too. A national day of action means ferries to and from Calais won't be running. Sailings between Dover and Dunkirk will, though, operate as normal. Now, if you're watching this programme last Friday night, you will not have forgotten these pictures from Shanghai, reminiscent of the height of the pandemic back here and around the world. This is one of the city's main hospitals, packed, as you can see, to overflowing with sick and dying victims of the virus. The end of restrictions has led to this. Debbie, our Asia correspondent, left us on Friday with a question. What happens when millions fan out from the cities to join families in the countryside for Chinese New Year celebrations? Those journeys are well underway now, and rural areas with far less healthcare provision are completely unprepared for what is beginning to hit them.
At this time of year, with temperatures rarely above zero, it can look quite bleak in rural Gansu. This was one of the hardest hit provinces in China when the government ditched its zero COVID restrictions. It is estimated more than 90% of the population here was infected by the beginning of January. And it is small towns and villages like this that are being warned about a second wave triggered by Chinese New Year. Dr. Liu told us she isn't equipped to handle another outbreak. She has no paracetamol left and very little ibuprofen. She says most clinics in the area don't have enough supplies, and the shortages have caused prices to rise. Earlier this week, she had to borrow a portable oxygen machine to help an 80-year-old man who came in with breathing difficulties. There was a funeral on the day we visited. We could hear it before we saw it because of the frequent eruption of fireworks. It is a Chinese custom to honour the dead and banish evil spirits. Infections quickly engulfed this community, and in one neighbourhood, 13 elderly people died in less than a month. The village is still recovering from that loss as they prepare for Chinese New Year. But it is medicines, not fireworks, they will need to ward off another wave of the virus. On a hillside above the village, there is evidence of the toll already taken. Brightly coloured fake flowers mark out several graves on the barren land. It has been a busy period for the funeral industry. It is travel on this scale that raises the concern. With no COVID checks in place, the world's largest human migration has returned to almost pre-pandemic levels. 2 billion passenger trips are expected to be made during the holiday period, which runs to the start of February. A majority will have already had the virus, but there will be some in this mass of people who are still infectious and travelling across the country for what can be large family gatherings.
农村的地区呢，相对我们的城市呢，它的情况更加复杂。那因此，我们需要通过多渠道、多部门共同努力来进行农村疫情的防控。
Dr. Liu has gone from treating routine illnesses in her community to providing life-saving care. She is hoping the predictions are wrong and the worst is over, not yet to come.
And Debbie is back in Beijing. Debbie, viewed from the outside world, China has gone from this very, very long zero COVID policy to zero restrictions almost overnight. Why the sudden change and how is it going down in China?
Well, Tom, for 3 years the government was telling us China will not live with the virus. It won't be allowed to spread unchecked, but that is exactly what has happened. So yes, millions of people here are questioning what was the point. It almost makes a mockery of all the lockdowns and testing we had to endure. Officially, the about turn was planned, but in reality, it was provoked by those nationwide protests at the end of November, a collapsing economy, and the fact that the zero COVID system couldn't control this latest virus. A majority of people will move on. They will enjoy their newfound freedom, but it will be harder, particularly for those who have lost someone. They are unlikely to rise up in anger, but some have dared to publicly call the government reckless for ending zero COVID so quickly. We have seen some protests from the tens of thousands of people that have now lost their jobs due to the collapse of the zero COVID industry. There is an undercurrent of discontent. But some of those who took part in those protests at the end of last year remain in detention. They helped win the freedom of the public, but have lost their own in the process. Speaking out here, as you know, comes with a cost.
OK, Debbie, thank you very much indeed. Now, Ukraine's security service is trying to work out why a helicopter fell out of the sky with some of President Zelensky's government ministers on board onto a suburb of the capital, Kyiv. It crashed near a nursery school. At the moment, it seems more likely to be an awful accident than a deliberate attack. One of the 14 dead was the president's friend and trusted interior minister. Mr. Zelensky said the loss of life had caused unspeakable pain.
Amid the long tragedy of this war, a fresh calamity with appalling human costs. One that deals a heavy political blow to Ukraine. In fog, in a suburb of Kyiv, a helicopter crashed close to a nursery school. A child is among the dead. Frantic parents accompanied the many injured to hospital. My friend said something had fallen on the kindergarten, says this young witness. He pulled 3 children out. On board the wrecked helicopter were senior government officials and Ukraine's interior minister. Denis Monastersky was a friend and close ally of President Zelensky.
Ukrainian families lost their loved ones today.
He led a minute's silence at the Davos World Summit in Switzerland and then appealed for the quicker delivery of support.
The supplies of Western tanks must outpace another invasion of Russian tanks. The restoration of security and peace in Ukraine must outpace Russia's attacks.
Ukraine covets this, the German Leopard tank, better than anything the Russians can deploy. NATO is expected to make a decision later this week, but Germany holds the export license and has been reluctant to grant permission. At the same conference, the German Chancellor faced this challenge.
It's only German hesitancy that has prevented it. So my question to you is, why wait?
The Ukrainians can rely on our support for their courageous fight. It is also clear that we will avoid that this is becoming a war between Russia and NATO.
A clash of East and West. That's how Vladimir Putin portrays this conflict. So we're better than his hometown, where the German siege of Leningrad was lifted 80 years ago to prepare the ground for a fresh offensive. He said Russia had been duped and cheated by the West, though victory was assured. In Ukraine, it seems likely the crash of the helicopter flying low in poor visibility was accidental, unlike so much of the agony deliberately inflicted on this nation. John Ray, News at 10.
Back here, Camilla, the Queen Consort, chose to make her first public appearance since Prince Harry's book came out at Aberdeen University to celebrate her 10th anniversary as its Chancellor. She faced the cameras, but unsurprisingly wasn't inclined to answer any questions.
Are you hurt by the comments in Prince Harry's book, Your Majesty?
The book has now become the fastest-selling work of non-fiction in the UK since records began a quarter of a century ago. One of the brightest young stars of women's tennis is through to the third round of the Australian Open. Sadly for British fans, it wasn't Emma Raducanu. She lost in 2 sets to the American 18-year-old Coco Gauff, 2 years Emma's junior, but ranked 70 places above her.
As a 15-year-old coming through.
If you think Emma's young, think again. There's another rising star on the scene. 18-year-old Coco Gauff, the teenage sensation, serving up success on the court. The American taking on the 20-year-old Emma Raducanu, 2 years on from her Grand Slam win in New York as an unseeded player, but nursing an ankle injury for the last few weeks. And it's taken its toll. She lost the first set 6-3. She did, however, fight back to take the second set to a tie-break. But 7th seed Gauff came out on top, winning the match in straight sets.
Gauff is there.
13 days ago, I would have, with what I had, to be in the draw right now is a massive, effort and achievement. I'd say all the chips were against us, and the chances of me playing this tournament were very, very low.
Kudos to Emma. I know she had a tough week in Auckland, so really good for her to be able to play this level after such a, scary moment.
There was better news for Cameron Norrie. Persistent rain saw his game against Frenchman Constant Lestienne delayed. The British #1 started strong, taking the first set with relative ease. But he didn't have an easy ride, losing the second set and slipping behind at one point in the third. He did finally overcome the French world number 55, 3-1, though well into the early hours of the morning.
A late night treat.
Injury also plagued old-timer Rafael Nadal. A hip problem caused his shock exit in the second round, as the American Mackenzie McDonald eliminated the defending champion in straight sets. Tomorrow morning, another big name takes centre stage as Andy Murray attempts to make it through to the third round, hoping his metal hip can once again defy the odds. Danny Sinha, News at 10.
Finally, the end of a long life simply lived. The world's oldest person, a nun from southern France, has died at the frankly incredible age of 118 and 3 weeks short of her next birthday. Lucille Randon had spent much of her life in a convent. She was known there as Sister André. She only actually gave up active work in the convent at the age of 108.
When Sister André was asked the secret of being the world's oldest person, she said, "Only the good Lord knows." Born Lucille Randon, she became a nun at 40, caring for orphans. In her later years, despite being blind and using a wheelchair, she still cared for others. She said she would be better off in heaven, but continued to savour earthly pleasures like chocolate and a glass of wine every day. When Lucille was born in 1904, not many homes had telephones. The Wright brothers had just made the world's first powered flight, and there were virtually no cars on the road. She survived not one but 2 world wars and witnessed the birth of many social revolutions, from the swinging 60s to the present day.
Joyeux anniversaire.
On her 117th birthday, she spoke of how thankful she was. It made me very, very happy because I met all those I love, and I thank heaven for giving them to me. I thank God for the trouble they went to. In one of her last interviews, she said people should help and love each other instead of hating. If we shared all that, things would be a lot better. Neil Connery, News at 10.
What an incredible story, 118. Who'd have believed it? That's it. Good night. Thanks for watching.
Visibility may be low this evening as the cold weather hits. Heinz Soups sponsors ITV National Weather.
Hello and a very good evening to you. Hope you're all keeping well. So we are expecting something a little bit milder by the time we get to the weekend, but in the short term it is staying cold and frosty across many parts of the UK. Still the risk of a few wintry showers in places, but for most of us a good deal of dry weather in the forecast. Now Thursday morning we'll get off to a cold and frosty start today. Some icy stretches in places. Do bear that in mind if you are heading out and about. And we've still got a few more of these showers too, especially across parts of Scotland, which could be of sleet and snow. Elsewhere the odd flurry, but for most actually throughout the day, plenty of dry weather, some lovely winter sunshine, but wrap up warm if you are heading out and about. Highs there generally between 3 and 7 degrees. And then on Friday, well, it's a frosty but a rather sunny start to the day. Then things start to change as we go through the weekend. Temperatures will be rising and we will see 1 or 2 showers in places. Bye-bye.
Heinz Soups sponsors ITV National Weather.